About to hand things over to Barbara Lalla, who's up here on stage. Barbara is a festival regular, recently retired from the University of West Indies at St. Augustine, where she is a linguist by profession, but she's also a fiction writer. She's published several novels, and there's another one on its way soon. Wasn't quite ready in time for this year's Bocas, but that's all right. And she is going to be having a conversation this afternoon with Godfrey Smith here beside me. Godfrey has been to Bocas before in, if I can remember how good my memory is, was it 2012? In 2012, he was the winner of the non-fiction category of the OCM Bocas Prize, and that was for his first biography of George Price, the former Belizean Prime Minister. And he seems to have a thing for prime ministerial biographies, because for his latest book, he's tackled a Jamaican Prime Minister. So we have a Jamaican scholar talking to a Belizean biographer, and we're going to hear a bit about the art of biography. We're going to hear a bit about the art of politics, maybe, and I think it's going to be a very stimulating discussion. So again, let's welcome them and let's get things started.
Good. Well, our author, Godfrey Smith, born in Belize City, educated at the University of the West Indies, Ray, and then Norman Washington Manley Law School in Jamaica, then Tufts University's Fletcher's Law School. Godfrey is a jurist, attorney, has been politician, has been member of the People's United Party, Attorney General, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so on and so on. And is now, you told me,
now a High Court judge in St. Lucia.
Yes. But he's also a notable biography, and as you've heard, he was the non-fiction winner of the OCM Bocas Prize in 2012. Now today we're especially interested in his newer work on Michael Manley. And what I wondered was whether you would like to just start us off by telling us about how you managed to negotiate the corridors between active politics and the political and historical writing of your biographies. How did you?
Well, I only started biography writing after my political career went up in flames and my spectacular defeat in 2008. So in the detritus of defeat, when one ponders the next move, it struck me, or I came to the realization that it was time to embark on a project that had been gestating inside of me for, I think, close to 18 years. Quite coincidentally, the decision to write the Price biography germinated when I saw a previous biography of Michael Manley in the UWI Jamaica bookshop. And I looked at it, I read it, I bought it. And after reading it, I thought to myself, but Belize's George Price might not be Michael Manley, but he was certainly a figure worth writing about. And so that's how the idea of writing about George Price was born. But after I finished law school, I went into law, practiced law, went into politics. And 18 years later, after I left politics in 2008, was when I finally got wrong. So I didn't do it when I was an active politician. I did it after.
Okay. Well, certainly your knowledge of political systems made you particularly sensitive, I think, to that. But what got me about it was that it was also a very strong literary work. Not every biography or autobiography of a prime minister is something that you can read comfortably, but this was a strong literary work and a fine character analysis. I think you projected the many Michael Manleys, and I wondered, you managed at the same time to achieve a profile of Jamaica, most especially the Jamaican thinker, which in the 60s, 70s, there were sort of incestuous intellectual connections between artists, journalists, activists, politicians. And I thought you got the many Manleys and the Jamaica. So you achieved and you sustained a nuance throughout. And I wondered how you went about arriving at this type of balance without flattening or oversimplifying the portraits.
I might not know the answer to that,
Or tell us anything
but
else
let
you
me
want to
start by saying I think the biggest compliment that I look forward to receiving about the books that I write is that it's an easy read. So I liked hearing you and others say, look, you can get through the book, it's easy to read. That's primarily because the one thing I cannot do is bore my own self writing. And I quickly realize when I'm boring myself, and I can't stand boring my own self, I bore very easily. So the main thing is to have a pace for the thing to be deep, but to move at a good pace as well.
It didn't bore me. And,
Good.
and I'm easily bored.
Well, that's the greatest compliment that, that anybody could pay me.
Yes.
I think you touched on it when you said because of my exposure to politics, I think that predisposes me to being able to assimilate the material at a fairly fast pace. How I put it together, how I structure it, how I maintain the balance, I'm not sure. I suppose it's a part instinct and part having a sense of imagination, a sense of drama, a sense of knowing how to transition, to move on, to keep it seamless, but most of all, to be objective and to bring out the hard facts, even though family members might say, oh, we don't want that in the book and so on. That's one of the more difficult parts too. I've had difficulties in both the Price biography and in this Michael Manley biography in terms of talking about things that people didn't want to talk about. Not that it, in any event, for instance, in the George Price work, one of the things that the party didn't want to come out was the fact that all his life, Price's bugbear was that he wanted to sell out Belize to Guatemala, which maintains a century-old claim over Belize. And he and the party had always denied that he ever took money from the Guatemalans. And he told me that I took money from the Guatemalans, but it was just to fight the British. No, there's nothing wrong with that. But the party never wanted that to come out, and they gave me hell for it and wanted threatened lawsuits and all sorts of things. But you have to stay faithful. In the same way with the Price thing, with the Michael Manley biography, Manley, in the hard days after he lost, took some money from the Castro regime. All parties need money.
And from Cuba too.
And from,
China.
And from the Palestinians as well. Yes. And there were some issues with the party in Jamaica over that. But I mean, he wasn't pocketing the money. And all parties need to raise funds. Everybody knew that Manley was a socialist sympathizer. But still there were those who thought, oh, this is going to be misinterpreted. You can't put that in. And of course, there were some things that couldn't be put in. Some of the more perverse aspects of his well-known sexual appetite. They put their foot down on some of those things. So some of the nicer bits had to be left out.
There's a good bit in. But you know, you use the word drama, so I want to ask you about that. Because somebody you quoted said, as far as his comment on Manley was, to think is to act. So he must have been talking about how swift Manley was to take action. But I want to look at the idea of acting. And I wondered, did you ever wonder how much was acting? He was a bit of a performer in many ways. He had to be. He really strung along the crowd. But I'm just thinking, you actually show what I recall myself. Remember, I'm a Jamaican and I lived through these things. I recall a sort of considered spontaneity about him. He, like the theatrics with the stripping off of the jacket and this kind of thing, the manipulation of code choice when he was getting the sugar workers excited and so on in their own terms. Did your insight into Michael Manley as performer ever lead you to doubt some of his genuineness? You convey his genuineness. Never.
That was just, well, part of his MO, but I think what I came away with after all the research that I did was that, I'd always been an admirer of Manley even before knowing him. What the research and the project left me with was that this man was he was a heavyweight intellectual.
Yes.
This was a man who, when he went into office, had a very clear understanding of the world economic system, why Jamaica could not, and the third world, could not advance under that system, and the necessity to change it. Now, I've been a politician, I've been in government. Oftentimes, it's when you complete a term or two that you're then ready to govern. When you're booted, it's only then you've developed some experience or knowledge of what the hell is going on. But here was a man who understood what was going on, in my view, of how the system worked. How he went about trying to do it, well, we can debate that, but that's a separate matter from his knowledge of it. But to directly answer your question,
You never doubted
I never doubted his passion, his intention, his egalitarianism,
Right.
which lay at the core of what he was.
He was
I
an
think.
indomitable champion of human rights. And there was that account which was so very vivid in your book of his lying down in protest while a vehicle is driving at him and comes to a halt, sort of barely off his head because of people throwing themselves forward on the bonnet. The JBC strike, which launched him as Joshua onto the national stage. Well, there were times when I felt a man like that should have carried it off. So where, in your view, did he go wrong? In other words, I mean, was the CIA really responsible for the chaos that was unleashed on us? Because chaos was unleashed on us in Jamaica. Was he? I don't think he was driven by personal lust for power. I think he was driven by ideas for the betterment of poor Jamaicans. But somehow along the way, a chaos was unleashed on us. Where did he go wrong?
Well, I mean, there was a whole range of events that came together. I think certainly CIA was involved. As his old friend Errol Barrow of Barbados told him once, man, you can do the things you want to do, but don't broadcast it, don't advertise it as socialism. You're going to get yourself into trouble. And that's exactly what happened. He unnecessarily attracted heat onto himself, scared Jamaican business class by doing things that he didn't have to do and parade and push in their faces.
A set of red herrings.
Yes.
And statements that freaked out people into moving out their money.
Totally. So he could have avoided a lot of it. I think one of the things that the more left-wing people in his party, like DK, the problem with, I mean, Michael had to have understood, or perhaps didn't understand until afterwards, that you can't marry the two. You can't be a socialist and wish to carry through these ideas and have a wide open democratic system. At the end of the day, for those who accused him of being a radical socialist, the truth is he was always a believer in democratic elections.
Yes.
And that is where he had difficulties with some in his party who thought, look, you can't survive this. You can't have it both ways.
And was it a combination, too, of the S word, socialism? Was the S word in Jamaica.
Yes.
There was a point where you were looking for a communist under your bed at night. So it was a scare. I mean, the middle class were afraid. But on top of that, Rex Nettleford identified one of his problems as what Rex called the Ragamuffin Element. And was it the combination, do you think, that worried people? Or was he, I mean, was Michael as innocent in the scandals that broke out over his head, like the Shell Oil granting these millions worth of waiver and all this? How innocent was he?
No, there's no doubt that his party had corruption. What I think can be said of Manley, as of Price in Belize, was that notwithstanding clear examples of scandals and corruption within his party, Manley himself, none of that came home to him. None of that was visited at his doorstep. So I think he himself was a man of integrity, died broke, I think, as many people know. And his family
he was a
never
big
really
spender.
had money.
No, but he was a big spender and had a fast lifestyle, fast
Yes,
cars,
well,
fancy stereo system.
quite so.
After this, he came in 72, he bought this fancy sound system,
Yes.
which cost half his salary as prime minister, and he had
Yes,
to get
correct.
rid of it. He was a spender. And you know, all of these strange economic, sort of ruinous economic policies in his own life. I wondered whether these sort of, what I call economic policies in his own life, what Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore called ruinous decisions and
Yes.
so on. Was this
Yes.
also part of what happened to the country?
Yes, I think there are those in
Yes.
his party, including Dr. Phillips right now, who is poised to lead the PNP, have said that, yes, Michael had a way of, he didn't care about where the money came from. He had grand ideas, and he wanted to get them implemented, so he would tell his finance minister, poor David Corey, well, I mean, he'd actually
Yes.
make announcements in Parliament without getting the sanction of his finance minister that, look, we're going to do this, we're going to have
Cole
free
would hear
education.
something for the first time.
Yes,
Yes,
and
when
then
it
have to
announced.
figure out how the
Yes.
devil he's going to finance it. So yes, his reckless approach. I mean, this was a man who had a sense of entitlement. He grew up
Yes.
not rich, but in what was the closest thing one could call Jamaican aristocracy.
Yes, patrician.
So he grew up in the arts,
Yes,
he grew up
yes.
in theater, culture, and so on, and really had a sense of entitlement and carried himself that way. And I suppose to some extent in government,
Yes.
that transferred into government as well.
He did unnecessarily scary things. One of the things that came across too in your book that I distinctly remember was his attending the funeral of this gunner. But was it Burry Boy?
Yes,
Burry Boy?
yes.
And so he seemed to be aligning himself with these set of gangsters who could an exploitation of gang violence. Then there was that side. Do you think he was innocent of that, or
I don't, but
did
when
he
I
just
when I
stumble into
first
it?
started researching this and
Yes.
spoke to people on both sides, because I was struck by the fact that prime ministers could be openly associating with big time gang leaders, and some of them even attended some conferences.
Yes.
So I was in shock, like, what? But they tell me, man, you have to understand Jamaican culture. That is the reality here. And both sides do it and so on. So yes, my answer to your question is definitely based on what I researched and found. Both sides, the JLP and the PNP, exploited gangs, used them to their benefit and so on. And who started it first? Well, that's a big debate. But it doesn't matter, I think, at the end of the day. Both sides were responsible. Both sides were guilty of sort of encouraging or facilitating or empowering
Yes.
some of these people.
You see, I don't know if everybody here, perhaps I take an understanding of what happened. You would, because you've written the book, and I lived through it. But one of the things was the gang violence that escalated into blood and fire outbreaks in 76. Massacres, a ferocity that led up to the declaration of a state of emergency, and then the recession, the falling tourist industry, the collapsing manufacturing sector, and the crippling strikes, blockades, protests, schools and businesses closing down. There were Jamaicans who perceived themselves as living in a civil war. And up to now, the older Jamaicans sometimes refer to it as the time of the Troubles. And so there is that sense that, in a way, he presided over this. And that what was it then? If his heart was in the right place, as many of us suspect, was it that he was a dreamer?
Oh, definitely. I think yes. Well, in retrospect, I suppose one could say he was a dreamer. I see him as a visionary who was ahead of his time. That view is shared by Sir Sridhar Ramphal, for instance, who I had to interview for the book, who said, look, Manley was just too big for the time and for Jamaica. I mean, look, this was a man who, unlike any other politician who has come on the scene since, could summon a prime minister of Canada, a prime minister of Australia, a prime minister of Britain, prime ministers in Africa, and convene a conference in Jamaica.
Yes.
And he was listened to,
Yes.
and he was admired and respected.
Yes.
I mean, in these days, you can barely have meetings with leaders of these big countries without them.
Yes.
As a former minister, I got the sense real quickly there'd be meetings of CARICOM ministers, foreign ministers, with some of these ministers in big countries. And first of all, you don't meet with your equivalent. They'll send some undersecretary. Yes. And you can actually see them surreptitiously looking at their watch to see, well, when will the meeting with these small-time little people be over? So those days are well behind us when a Caribbean leader could summon and be listened to by.
I think his charisma operated on many levels, including the personal level, which came across beautifully in the book. There's this wonderful scene where he's at a meeting and gunmen come in, and Michael stands up, because he's a big, powerful, impressive, handsome-looking figure, and he stands up, and a set of women throw themselves in front of him. But they're short like me, so it doesn't do him much good. Anyway, he didn't get shot. The thing is that these little things really liven up the book. I fell out, I think, with you when it came, I think perhaps the representation of himself and his children. I would not have liked to have been one of his children, with this swift turnover of mothers and auntie-mothers and so on. But also, I thought as an authority figure, I'm sorry, I have to confess, first of all, that I am not very good at distinguishing the personal life and the public life, because I do think that there are leakages across. And he seemed to me as a not very sound authority figure in many ways. Like, he has his 16-year-old daughter. She gets expelled from school. He brings her home. She's 16. She starts to come home drunk in the wee hours. And his answer is to build a separate entrance so she won't disturb him. And your conclusion, Mr. Godfrey, is that he made his children take responsibility for their own decisions. I feel you absolved him. And I don't know, tell me what you think about it.
Well, that wasn't my conclusion. That was that's his approach. And his approach, as all his children who I spoke to, each one of them said to me, well, the older ones, that he wasn't a very touchy-feely kind of father. He carried on intellectual conversations with them. So as a father, I mean, he was piss poor. He was a disaster. And I think he would readily admit that he was never there for his children. In his waning days, when he had his youngest son, he tried to spend some quality time, and he begged them not to go into politics, interestingly. Anything but that. Flip burgers, he said, but don't go into politics. So I think he regretted it at the end of the road. But certainly no, as a parent, I think he left quite a lot to be desired, and perhaps felt that the way to raise children was to carry on intellectual conversations with them.
I think a little of that is good. I had a rather nice father who was both willing to pat me on the head and hug me up, but also carry on intellectual conversations. So I have no complaint about that. But, well, to come off that, I mean, I wondered, in drawing your picture of Manley and therefore Jamaica, there's also Siaga, and your picture of the opposition, of course, comes across. Was Siaga really the black art man? I mean, was he really that bad in the picture? Because he does come across as almost a necromancer, I think.
Interesting. I don't think that. Well, I don't share that view. I don't think that that's how I attempted to portray him. By the way, there's an interesting anecdote. I emailed him,
Siaga?
yes, and said, I want to interview you for Manley book. He said, no, don't. You won't interview me. Go and read my biography at chapter so-and-so, page so-and-so. And everything you need to know about Manley is right in there, that I think. And I took his advice, and yes, I got some good information. But no, I don't think that Siaga was anything like a necromancer. He obviously had his strengths, which was in finance and economics, and their approaches were different. Interestingly, at Michael's funeral, well, not his funeral, at his whatever tribute was paid to him in Parliament, Siaga paid tribute to the fact that in the end, Manley had come around to his way of thinking because, as we were aware, in his last term in government, people say no, he hadn't abandoned his socialist principles, but in reality, he had gone back to the mainstream in terms of his approach to economics.
But not everybody admired him for the about face. I mean, after the genuine work he had done on apartheid and all of that, there had been people who had really admired him on that Council on Hemispheric Affairs and so on. And they complained that he had converted from forensic lion to Washington's parlor pussy. That, you had these wonderful phrases that you gathered.
Yes.
You really assembled some brilliant gems of expression there. But that remodeling, that reinvention of himself that took place, and the change from the Kariba to the grey suit and everything else, he said he hadn't changed his politics. But the U.S. must have thought he had, or they wouldn't have coughed up the money after Gilbert.
Absolutely, yeah. They treated him royally in the second coming of Manley.
Yes.
And I'm left in no doubt that he saw the socialist experiment as a failure, and that he came to the position, to the view, that for Jamaica to work, for his country to move forward, he had to fit it into the mainstream, which is what he tried to do.
What he did.
Yeah. So I think he came full circle. He, many in his party would deny that he'd really done a volte-face, but I think he did.
You think he did? But just to return, because we want to get some feedback from the folks gathered here. But before that, I just wanted to come back to your technical achievement, which I thought was phenomenal. And I just wanted to say, I've been reading some biographies and autobiographies. I'm basically in literature and linguistics and not that interested in political biographies and autobiographies of themselves. But I have been reading them because a graduate student that I share with Dr. Skeet over there has recently completed an excellent dissertation, and she was writing on the ways in which Caribbean prime ministers profile themselves in their autobiographies. What is the picture? How do they characterize themselves for how they want that to go forward? And in the light of this, I thought it was interesting to watch you profile Michael Manley in your biography. And you treated him with understanding, taking an insider perspective. Were you sort of aware of yourself as involving yourself in literary characterization, in choices of what to include, what to omit, how to angle events, situations, building up pictures on your subject? How did you?
Yes, the starting point is my starting point in writing a biography is to try to make the person walk again. Is to try to reconstruct his life as it happened, as it really happened. So the first biography, there's only one other biography of Manley that I'm aware of, by an American historian called Darrell Levy. What I thought about that biography, although it was well researched, was that it compartmentalized the person. So when I'm writing somebody's life, if today he goes to work, has a cabinet meeting, finishes it, goes home and takes his wife to dinner, calls his mother after that, you want the layers of the onion to be peeled away as it happened in real time. So that was the basic approach I adopted. It can't be how I wanted it to be or to put them together randomly. It really has to be researching so deeply, understanding him so well that you actually try to relay the events as they happened.
Right.
So that's the general approach. In terms of the technical aspects of it, yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, the main consideration is to create depth and detail without getting it bogged down. Like yourself, I've read many, many biographies, and quite a lot of them difficult to get through. you end up jumping and flipping through.
Yes.
And so, yes, I was very conscious about structuring, positioning, and laying the framework while maintaining the integrity of the information, how it happened. So you only have a small leeway. It's not fiction. I can't make things up, you know.
And where did you get all of the documents? I mean, you got a lot of historical documentation. You did a lot of oral, you had your
interviews.
Oral interviews and so on.
I think one of the main things that gave insight was getting from Michael's son, Joseph Manley, the private papers and letters that passed between Michael Manley and Rex Nettleford, who was Manley's counterfoil, who was his, his intellectual sparring partner. That gave a lot. All the private letters from his daughters were handed over. So again, that provides details and information that was not had before. Speaking, having the opportunity to have interviewed all his family members, living ex-wives and children, was very important. And apart from that, because I never met the man, I had to immerse myself in how he sounded and looked and acted. So essentially, I went to the National Library of Jamaica and got everything visually that existed on him. I went on YouTube and looked at everything available on him to get a sense of how he moved, how he talked, how he sounded, and that kind of thing.
I want to know, I have a million other questions, but let me allow other people here. So I wondered if there were any questions or comments from anyone at this point. Here we have, do we have a mic? A mic is coming. I think it would be better.
Is it on? Yes. Perhaps you'd addressed it and I hadn't heard. But what I did hear was how you spoke of him, Michael Manley, in his, what I would call a political decline. I don't mean his aging. I mean the change in what appeared to be a shift. The International Monetary Fund program's impact on Jamaica were profound. And I wondered if that was part of your mandate for writing the book. The International Monetary Fund's structural adjustment programs that were imposed on Jamaica as the terms for the debt relief, to loan money to Jamaica to do its, to carry on its function as a government. So I was just asking that, because the importance of that being that Jamaica was one of the first experiments in that what became a global economic system that now reigns all over the world. I was just curious as to whether, when you were talking about the man and doing a biography of the man, because I think, having been a young woman then at the time, that International Monetary Fund imposition would have to change his politics, whether he liked it or not.
Yeah, you say imposition, but at the end of the day, it was his decision, you may recall. He resisted it at first. The left-wing members of his party prevailed, and they decided they weren't going to go that route. But eventually, when he did do it, he thought that it was the only thing left. He had no choice. He didn't like it, and at the end of the day, in his final days, in fact, one of his last interviews, public interviews, he expresses a great deal of bitterness about the whole IMF experience. So that was a very bitter pill for him indeed, very much so.
Even when, even afterwards, when he had made that about face, things continued to plummet. I mean, I had some family members come to stay with me for a couple of weeks, and it was like in the 2-3 week visit, the Jamaican dollar went from 11 to 1 to 22 to 1, and they said, you know, our whole way of life has been cut in half. My sister said the 3 chickens in my freezer have appreciated. I mean, the thing, it was a crazy situation. The money just kept sliding down, and you didn't know how much further it would go, even when you thought that they were picking up. It was quite. But I see BC with his arm.
Yes, I wanted to ask. I never met Michael Manley, much to my regret.
Neither did I, to my regret as well.
Well, there goes my question, because I saw him once on television. I was passing television. I think it would have been 76 elections. There was just a clip at the end of the news, and he leaned forward. He was talking to his people, and he leaned forward and he said, "Make no mistake, I am for you." I repeated it, "I am for you." And I thought he was talking to me in Trinidad, watching it on the news. So my question was going to be, if you had met, on the assumption that you'd met him, and then if you had met Bastio Pandey, who also is extremely charismatic. He should have been a rock star, really.
If a bit short.
All short people tend to compensate.
What are you saying about short people?
Short people find the need to compensate.
Manley, as you must know, was gifted in many ways. As I've said, he was a tall, imposing figure, extremely handsome, extremely lean and athletic, well-built, vigorous intellectual, baritone voice. I mean,
an orator.
The man was
He was an
naturally
orator,
charismatic. Yeah. And what his detractors say about him is that they didn't want to listen to him lest he persuaded them to his way of thinking. I've met several people who said, look, we don't want to talk to In fact, there's an interesting anecdote where one of Jimmy Carter's senior, I can't remember whether it is National Security Advisor, when Michael called for the famous meeting in Runaway Bay, where prime ministers of Australia, Canada, Nigeria, and all over the world attended. Carter wanted to come to the meeting, but those close to him said, no, we don't want you near Manley. So the man really was very persuasive and very engaging, very charismatic.
Yeah, and of course he projected that too through the whole Joshua image, and he walked with his rod. He said this is a rod of correction and so on. And this was the rod of Joshua, and he was going to lead them out of oppression and so on. And I think he meant it, but somehow he didn't carry. And you know, I thought of him this morning when we had that the CLR discussion. And I thought, here is somebody who is a philosopher, who is a thinker, who is a visionary. But at least he didn't become prime minister. Would CLR have made a good prime minister? I don't know. I don't think we can question the intellectual strength and so on of Manley. The question is, could he cut it in practical terms?
He was a disaster, Manley?
Yes,
he
Michael
was a
Manley.
Disaster in practical terms.
In practical terms. I know, I was there.
He couldn't run a household. He couldn't run a farm. He loved to think himself as a farmer.
That farm.
And he he just...
They said he had 100 and something. He said he had 100 and something
he
workers.
Saw himself as an architect building things that collapsed.
Yes.
I mean, he was a total disaster.
Yes, he needed 5 people to run his property, but he wanted...
celebrated the fact when he said, told his daughter, come, we'll go on an adventure. And the adventure was him pumping gas in his car. I mean, that was an accomplishment for him. He could do that on his own, you know.
Yes. But the thing was, what was not funny was to just watch the country sliding into disarray and order, and disorder and bloodshed and being somehow unable to come out of it. So there are things, I read this thing. It was a very mixed response because I thought it's such an excellent and readable book. I thought there was so much truth to it. I thought that you had presented a lot objectively, but then there was also the sense that, the sympathy for this guy, he really mashed up Jamaica.
Well, did he, look, he really mashed up Jamaica. Yes, I suppose there's a view
I want
for
to come
that,
back and qualify that. But first, we have a question.
Actually, the thing about it, the question I was kind of going to ask was kind of a lead into that. I came in late, obviously, but I want to ask. I remember watching Life and Death, the documentary, and I remember one of the striking things for me was Manley's regret at having taken the IMF into Jamaica. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to us now as we are going through a possible situation now. And I wanted you to shed some light on that and your insights on that.
Into what? Into the IMF thing?
No, not necessarily into the IMF thing, but into his as a biographer, into what you would have found out about his regrets about what he did.
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah. He regretted the IMF experience. I thought he found it was just bogus, it was wrong for Jamaica. But I think he realized that that was a structure that he couldn't break out of. When he went into government, into office, he understood how that was set up. Mm-hmm. And he tried to change that structure by by being one of the champions of what's called the new international economic order. So he knew straight away, look, third world countries can't go anywhere if we export primary products, main products, raw products at small prices, at cheap prices. They're taken into the industrial countries. They're manufactured and sold back to us at high prices. Buying machines are he realized all of that and tried to work with many countries to restructure that. That's what the big meeting in Runaway Bay with other world leaders was about.
Right.
He never succeeded in doing it.
Right.
He was very instrumental in creating the International Bauxite Association, like the oil cartels and so on. He knew, look, we have to come together and position ourselves economically. Otherwise, we'll never break out of this trade situation.
Yes. But then, of course, those forces prevailed and
those
Jamaica
forces
mash
prevailed.
up.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Jamaica mash up.
Yes.
But before there is a question coming up, but before I do, I want, just because in being the devil's advocate here, I have brought up quite a number of negative things. But there is one note that I would like to just before I take your question, sir, and that is that this year the NGC Bocas Lit Fest has an emphasis on human rights. And I think it is fitting that before we end, we take note of the fact that you projected Manley's passion for human rights. Ultimately, Rex Nettleford said that what Michael Manley accomplished was the smadditization. In Jamaica, when you become smaddy, you become somebody. So Rex said that what Michael Manley achieved was the smadditization of Jamaican society. And he dismantled a colonial mindset that had prevented ordinary Jamaicans from recognizing their own value. And I would like to make sure that before this was something that preoccupied people who are loyal to him, like that character Marjorie, whom he portrayed so beautifully. And before we leave, I'm going to take this question, but I want to make sure that you tell us before you leave if there's anything else you would like to say about his legacy of smadditization.
Dr. Peter Phillips as well says that, look, if I were to pinpoint the one great legacy of Manley, it was allowing black Jamaicans to feel that they could rise to positions of leadership, authority, etc. in Jamaica. And that's a huge, huge accomplishment. A note about biography writing. Stay away, for those of you who wish to do it, stay away from the big-time politicians and so on, and interview the little people, the little secretaries, the little gardeners, the little drivers. The best anecdotes are from them. The officials tend to be a little bit guarded and careful. It's hell to get anything interesting from them. You know, so the little people have all the information you want, because you can't have a good, easy read without plenty of genuine anecdotes.
I want to hear from this gentleman who's
Okay, good afternoon. I just wanted to ask you, what you just said was a lead-in to what I'm going to ask. Having not met Michael Manley, having done a vast body of research, interviewed his family, people who are associated with him, what kinds of challenges did you have in writing the biography in terms of being subjective? Because you are right, it's supposed to be a biography reflecting the life of the man and his work and his legacy. Clearly, there would be, in any biography written by whoever, a level of subjectivity. And what kinds of challenges did you have in and secondly, how, I haven't read your book, I've not yet. But in terms of the nuances, capturing the nuances of someone like Michael Manley, who was essentially an upper-class Jamaican, having the connection with the masses, which was one of the highlights or the hallmarks, and how effectively do you think you would have captured this? Because that was the essence of the connection.
No, that's a judgment you will have to make after you've read it, how effectively I've captured it. I think the driving thing to be objective is, for me at least, is I want the book to be well received. And it can't be well received if you're doing a subjective, if it's a hagiography. So it's just a desire. You have to set out to do an objective work, and you do that by researching. I think the thing that distinguishes the work, if it is distinguished, is the depth of research. So you have to go in when you know that you're faced with a figure, a titan like Manley. You have to set as your objective a massive amount of research that nobody else has done to make sure, because more than half the stuff you find can't be used. I mean, to get 400 pages, you have to have a whole stack of information. And so obviously the research has to be deep and wide and sweeping and continuous. And but yes, to be objective, you have to strive for objectivity by hearing what other people had to say about him. Yes.
Well, I think that our time is just about up almost. I do want, if there was one more question, just one. One more question.
I grew up in Jamaica in the 70s. Michael Manley was a friend of my father. I heard a lot about him, positive and negative. I'm assuming that in your research, you would have also heard a lot that was positive and negative about him. I have a concern, and I haven't read your book, so I'm not clear, what the full thesis is, but I know that part of his legacy is an attitude that many of us of my age developed, of one of caring for our society.
Of caring
for our society. And it was mentioned, the Somatization, as Professor Nettleford said. But that was not just about the little people, as you have described them. But it was something that I think many of us learned about our culture and our society to value and respect it. And I wonder, my comment is a lead up to your comment about speaking to the little people, the little secretary and the little gardener, etc. Do you think that attitude of looking at little people perhaps is part of the legacy that Michael Manley tried to change?
I suppose I can do no better than his constituency secretary, Marjorie Taylor, who was his person in the constituency, went house to house with him, campaigned with him, who ended up taking over his constituency and ended up as an ambassador to the United Nations. And at the tribute in Parliament to him, she said, here I am, a little girl from whatever area she came from, rose to be an ambassador to the UN. And it could never have been done except under Michael Manley. So I can do no better than to repeat that.
I'm sorry, but I guess maybe I was misunderstood. It's just that describing her as a little person is part of what Michael Manley was trying to change.
Yes.
We have no little people in Jamaica.
Yes. Well, when I said it that way is to distinguish between the big, powerful politicians and those who you might think in approaching a biography, boy, we have to deal with all the big people, but actually, it's a tribute, actually, when I said what I said, because I'm saying the best, real, genuine stories come from the drivers, the gardeners, the constituency secretary, the real information, the real flavor that makes the book what it is comes from those people.
Well, I think at this point we have to give our mics back. We have to turn in our mics. And I just want at this point to thank Godfrey for this book and for coming and being with us in the interview.
My pleasure, Barbara.
And we have to also give him a little work to sign some books. Yeah, I have mine to sign, so you have things to do this afternoon. And get him started on that at once. But thank you very much for being here.
Barbara.
And thank you for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you, members of the audience.